something shifted in the data this year, and it's specific enough that it changes what you should actually be thinking about right now, not at some vague future point. This year, the question isn't whether AI is affecting white-collar work. That question is settled. The data has been settling it for about 18 months. What the data has not done yet is answer the question that actually matters to you personally. Whether where you sit puts you in the high-pressure zone, or whether the dread you've been carrying is bigger than the actual risk, that distinction is everything. Because calibrated fear is something you can work with. Formless dread, the kind that arrives at 2 a.m. and doesn't have a specific shape, is not. This video is about giving it a shape. Here's the promise. By the time this is done, you'll have a clear, evidence-based picture of which roles are facing the most immediate structural pressure, and a specific frame for figuring out where your own role sits on that map. Not reassurance. Not catastrophizing. The actual picture. Let's start with why everything you've already read about AI and jobs has probably left you more confused than clear. Here's the problem with everything you've already read about AI and jobs. It's not that the coverage is wrong exactly, it's that most of it is optimized for clicks, not for calibration. And the two dominant narratives, total replacement on one end, nothing to worry about on the other, are both doing the same thing. They're leaving you without a specific, usable picture of your actual situation. The catastrophizing version confirms your worst fear and gives you no direction. The reassurance version dismisses a real and growing pressure and leaves you unprepared. Neither version is what someone with a mortgage, a family, and 12 years in a particular field actually needs. What you need is what the data actually shows. Not the version designed for people with nothing at stake, but the version that helps you think clearly about your specific situation. So here's what the research actually shows. Anthropic published a study in early 2026, one of the most detailed attempts yet to map which jobs AI is actively performing versus which it merely could perform. The gap between those two numbers is significant. The finding that stands out most: AI is currently operating well below its technical capability in most fields. The lag exists because of legal constraints, integration friction, and the fact that humans still need to review AI's outputs in many contexts. But the researchers are explicit. That lag is temporary. The implication is straightforward. The displacement that's already measurable today is the early phase of something that will accelerate. And the workers the research identifies as most at risk are not, contrary to what most people assume, low-skilled or entry-level. They are older, highly educated, and well-paid. That is not a comfort for anyone in this audience. It is, however, accurate, and accurate is where useful starts. Now, before we get to the specific roles facing the most pressure, there's a reframe that changes everything about how to think about this. Before we get to the specific roles facing the most pressure, there's a reframe that changes everything about how to think about this. Most people, when they hear AI is going to replace white-collar jobs, hear AI is going to eliminate my title. That's not what's happening, at least not yet. And not uniformly. What AI is actually doing is eliminating layers of jobs. Specifically, the most repeatable, rule-based, documentation-heavy, pattern-matching layers of white-collar work. And this matters enormously for how you assess your own situation. The question that matters is not, is my job title on some at-risk list? The question that matters is, what percentage of the tasks that make my role valuable are now automatable, and what's left? This is not semantic wordplay. It is the difference between panic and strategy. A title can survive while everything that made the entry-level pipeline viable gets quietly automated underneath it. What that produces is not immediate mass unemployment. What it produces is something subtler and, for many people, more unsettling. Roles that still exist, but whose compensation is being quietly compressed, whose hiring pipelines are contracting, and whose career ladders are missing several rungs that used to exist below them. Goldman Sachs' research on workers who lost roles to AI displacement found that when they landed new positions, they accepted pay cuts of 10 to 30%, depending on how much of their prior work overlapped with what AI can now do cheaply. That is not AI taking jobs. That is AI restructuring the compensation architecture of entire job families. Quietly and without announcement. The task-level reframe is what makes this analyzable. Because you know what your tasks are. You know which ones require genuine human judgment and which ones are, if you're honest, largely documentation and pattern matching. That's the diagnostic. That's the question worth sitting with. So let's look at which task families are actually facing the most immediate structural pressure right now. Now, the specific picture. The research across Brookings, Goldman Sachs, the IMF, and the Anthropic Labor Study converges on a fairly consistent picture of which task families face the most immediate structural pressure, not which titles disappear. Which task layers are being automated first? The highest pressure zone, right now, is administrative and clerical work in all its forms. Data entry, scheduling, document preparation, internal reporting, basic correspondence. The Brookings Institution identified approximately 6.1 million U.S. clerical workers in a high-exposure category and noted they also have among the lowest adaptive capacity, meaning fewer transferable skills and less financial cushion to navigate a transition. The second zone, and this is where it gets more personal for people in this audience, is entry-level professional work in knowledge-intensive fields. Junior financial analysts. The modeling, the variance analysis, the earnings summaries, tasks that previously justified entire hiring tiers are now first drafted by AI tools in seconds. Paralegals and legal research associates. Document review, contract analysis, case research. All core paralegal tasks, all now performable by AI at scale. Content and marketing coordinators. First draft copy, SEO content, social posts, campaign briefs. Increasingly AI-generated, increasingly not requiring a full-time hire. Entry-level software developers. GitHub, Copilot, and similar tools have already produced measurable declines in junior developer hiring. Goldman Sachs data shows a 16% employment decline among 22 to 25-year-old workers in AI-exposed roles between late 2022 and mid-2025. And Cornell University research found that companies adopting AI reduced junior hiring by about 13%. Here is the architecture of what's actually happening. AI is augmenting senior workers while substituting for junior ones. The result is a bifurcation. Experienced professionals who adopt AI tools become more productive, which makes them more valuable. But the entry-level pipeline, the apprenticeship layer of white-collar work, is contracting, which creates a specific problem for anyone in the 35 to 50 range who is already in a role that doesn't fit, and who is counting on a stable, recognizable job market to pivot into. The market is still there, but the structure of it is changing faster than most people's mental model of it. That's not a reason to freeze. That is a reason to move before the decision is made for you. The general picture is useful. What's more useful is knowing specifically where your role sits on it. Not in the abstract, but based on your actual function, your sector, and the task composition of your work. There's a resource in the description built exactly for that. It's a role-by-role assessment that produces a specific displacement probability picture for the most common white-collar functions, along with a skill gap action list for the roles facing the most pressure. Not a generic quiz, a structured assessment with a specific output. Link in the description, which brings us to the most important part: what you actually do with this information. Now, what do you actually do with this? Because the goal here isn't to leave you with a clearer version of the fear. The goal is to leave you with something actionable. The research is consistent on one point that doesn't get enough coverage. The workers most at risk are not the ones whose roles have AI exposure. 60% of advanced economy jobs have significant AI exposure. That number is too large to be a useful filter. The workers most at risk are the ones whose roles have AI exposure and who are not actively building the capacity to be on the productive side of that exposure. There is a 56% wage premium, according to PwC's 2026 data, for workers with genuine AI-integrated skill sets. Simultaneously, wages are compressing for workers in routine cognitive roles who are not augmenting their output with AI. The gap between those two trajectories is widening, and the window to choose which side of that gap you're on is not 5 years from now. Based on what the data shows right now, the structural effects will be most pronounced between 2027 and 2030 as current AI deployments mature and compound. Which means this year is still early enough to move deliberately. It is not early enough to treat the question as theoretical. Here's the specific frame that comes out of the evidence. The research identifies 3 domains where AI consistently underperforms relative to what human professionals do well. First, genuine stakeholder judgment, not just communicating a decision, but reading the room, managing the political complexity of a decision, and holding relationships that are built on trust accumulated over time. I cannot replicate that. Not yet. Possibly not soon. Second, contextual interpretation. The ability to take ambiguous, incomplete, or contradictory information and produce a judgment that is defensible, not just statistically plausible. This is where senior professionals consistently outperform AI, and it is precisely the skill that the junior layer of most knowledge professions was supposed to develop over 5 to 10 years of entry-level work. The entry-level pipeline is contracting, which means the professionals who have that contextual depth are scarce. That scarcity is a protection. Third, AI-integrated output. The Federal Reserve wage data is clear. Workers who use AI tools effectively become more valuable, not less. Not because they produce better work, though often they do, but because they can produce comparable work in a fraction of the time, which means they can take on more scope, more complexity, more of the work that still requires a person. The protection frame is this: roles that combine genuine stakeholder complexity, contextual judgment, and active AI integration are not in the high exposure zone. They are in the zone that is actively growing in value. The question for you is, which of those three does your current role allow you to develop? And if the honest answer is none of them, because the role is largely documentation and process execution and has been for years, then what you're feeling is not paranoia. It is correct information. The mechanism has a name now. The exposure isn't random. It follows the task architecture. And once you can see your own task architecture clearly, you stop asking, "Is my job safe?" and start asking a better question: which version of where I'm going puts me on the right side of this? That question has an answer. It is not the same answer for everyone, which is exactly why the general picture was always going to be insufficient. If this opened a question about where your specific role sits, there's a structured assessment in the description that builds that picture, role by role, sector by sector, with a specific output you can act on. Link in the description and in the pinned comment. When you look honestly at your role's task composition, the things you actually spend most of your time doing, how much of it would survive a rigorous automation audit? Drop your honest answer below. You came to this video with something specific, a fear that had probably been abstract until recently, and then became less abstract after a headline, or a restructuring, or a quiet conversation that made the question feel suddenly personal. Here's what the data offered by the end of this. Not that your job is fine. Not that you should panic. What it offered is this: the pressure is real, it is measurable, and it follows a specific pattern, the task architecture of roles, not their titles. That is actually good news. Not because the situation is comfortable, but because the specific is always more survivable than the vague. A named threat is one you can map. A mapped threat is one you can move around. The people who navigate this transition well, and they exist in every sector at every level, are not the ones who were least exposed. They are the ones who looked at the data before the decision was made for them and used the window they had to move deliberately rather than reactively. That window is still open. What you did today, spending time actually looking at the evidence, is not nothing. It is, in fact, the beginning of a different relationship with this question. Not one defined by dread that arrives at 2 a.m. without a specific shape. One defined by a clear enough picture that it becomes possible to plan. You are not someone who is waiting to find out what happens to people like you. You are someone who went and looked. That is the distinction that actually matters. Not someone else's version of this, yours.